On October 11th, an event occurred in Lahore that sent shockwaves across Pakistan, sparking protests that would ultimately pit students against powerful institutions. At the heart of the unrest was a horrifying allegation of assault within the premises of one of the most prominent private educational institutions in the country, Punjab College, the Gulberg campus. What began as an alleged crime against a young woman would soon grow into a nationwide movement, with students demanding justice and accountability, while the government and the institution were accused of a cover-up aimed at protecting Pakistan's image. The alleged crime, which triggered the protests, took place on the morning of October 11th, when a first-year student was lured into the basement of Punjab College's campus by a van driver on the pretext of discussing unpaid fees. Once inside the secluded basement, the girl was allegedly assaulted by a security guard. The crime was brutal, and the screams of the victim reportedly alerted a teacher, who arrived on the scene. But it was too late. The girl was in critical condition, while the perpetrator managed to flee the campus. The victim was taken to the hospital, where she was admitted to the ICU. As this harrowing account began to circulate on social media, outrage mounted rapidly. Students and parents alike were horrified at the thought that such a violent crime could occur in the very institution they trusted to provide education and safety. Yet what followed was not swift action or transparent investigations, but a calculated denial by the institution, a move that many saw as the beginning of a cover-up, designed to protect its reputation and that of its powerful stakeholders. Almost immediately after the alleged incident surfaced, the administration of Punjab College dismissed the reports as fake propaganda. They outright denied that such an assault had occurred, claiming that the allegations were part of a deliberate campaign to harm the institution's image. With their reputation on the line, the administration was quick to assure the public that there was no truth to the circulating claims. The college, part of the sprawling Punjab group of colleges, is owned by Mian Mahmood, a prominent businessman and politician. The institution's rapid denial, coupled with Mahmood's silence, raised alarms among students, rights activists, and the public. Was this a case of an influential individual using his political power to bury a scandal? Many believe so. The administration's apparent attempt to deflect attention from the allegations added fuel to the fire. What should have been a time for investigation and healing instead became a battle over narrative control. As the administration doubled down on its denials, students, already grappling with fear and anxiety, began to demand justice. By October 14th, protests began to erupt. What started as small gatherings of students outside various campuses of Punjab College soon grew into widespread demonstrations. Students, predominantly young women, took to the streets to demand accountability, not just for the alleged assault, but for the institution's failure to protect its students and its unwillingness to admit the gravity of the situation. The administration's reaction, they argued, was not just indifferent, but actively complicit in covering up the crime. As the days went by, the protests gained momentum. Lahore streets became the epicenter of student dissent. But soon, similar scenes began to unfold in cities across Punjab, including Gujarat, Sargodha, and Rawalpindi. What began as a localized outcry in one city had morphed into a nationwide movement. As students across the province joined in solidarity, calling for justice and expressing their fear over their own safety in educational institutions. While the protests were driven by outrage over the alleged crime, they were also fueled by a broader distrust of the administration and the government's unwillingness to provide protection to victims of sexual violence. It was this growing sense of systematic injustice that kept the protests alive and increasingly impassioned. Under mounting pressure, the provincial government announced that the security guard allegedly involved in the assault had been arrested. However, this did little to quell the protests. For many, this token arrest felt like an attempt to pacify the public, rather than a genuine step towards justice. The van driver, who played a key role in luring the victim to the basement, was still at large, and there was little clarity from law enforcement regarding the progress of the investigation. As protests continued to intensify, they were met with a brutal response from the authorities. On October 17th, Lahore witnessed one of the darkest days of the movement. Police, in full riot gear, confronted protesting students with batons and tear gas. The peaceful demonstrations quickly devolved into chaotic scenes of violence. Dozens of students were injured, and many were arrested. Their cries for justice were drowned out by the sound of police sirens and tear gas canisters, and the streets of Lahore were transformed into battlegrounds. Meanwhile, in Rawalpindi, students set fire to college furniture and blocked major roads, expressing their outrage at the government's heavy-handedness. As protests spread, the violence escalated. In Gujarat, a security guard was killed in clashes between protesters and the police. This tragic turn of events only deepened the national divide, with the police cracking down harder and protesters becoming even more determined. By October 18th, over 250 students had been arrested across various cities, many facing charges for disturbing the peace. Families rushed to police stations, desperately seeking the release of their children. But the authorities remained unyielding. The message was clear. The government would not tolerate dissent, no matter the cause. In response to the growing unrest, the Punjab government took drastic measures. On October 17th, all schools, colleges, and universities across Punjab were ordered to shut down for 2 days. The decision affected nearly 18 million students, and while the government claimed it was done to restore calm, it was widely interpreted as an attempt to suppress the protests, rather than addressing the root cause, the alleged crime, and the subsequent mishandling of the situation. The government seemed more interested in containing the damage to its image. The shutdown of educational institutions was not the only form of suppression. The Federal Investigation Agency, or the FIA, was deployed to track down individuals who had shared information about the incident online. Journalists, students, and activists found themselves in the government's crosshairs, with many facing arrest or threats of legal action for spreading false information. This crackdown on free speech only bolstered the belief that the government was not interested in justice, but in silencing dissent. For many students, the government's aggressive response confirmed their worst fears. This was a cover-up. The administration, in collaboration with law enforcement, was more concerned about maintaining Pakistan's international reputation than it was about protecting its own citizens. The arrest of the security guard felt like a hollow gesture, overshadowed by the brutality used to silence those who dared to demand accountability. What had initially been a protest about one crime had now grown into something much larger. The movement had become a call for systematic change, an end to the immunity that protects powerful institutions at the expense of the most vulnerable. For decades, Pakistan's institutions have been criticized for their mishandling of cases involving sexual violence, with survivors often left without justice due to a culture of silence and victim blaming. Student unions, banned since 1984, could have provided a formal avenue for students to express their grievances. But in their absence, students had to take to the streets. The protests were not just about one girl's assault. They were about the fear and anger of an entire generation that has grown up in a system that fails to protect them. Political voices such as Usman Ghani of the Jamaat-e-Islami's youth wing joined the movement, calling for the reinstatement of student unions and warning that Pakistan's institutions would continue to fail its students unless there was greater accountability. Rights organizations, including the Aurat Foundation, condemned the government's handling of the crisis, pointing to the alarming rise in sexual violence in Pakistan. According to a report by the Sustainable Social Development Organization, 7,010 cases of rape were reported in Pakistan in 2023, 95% of them in Punjab. These statistics, they argued, were only the tip of the iceberg. As the protests continue to unfold, it is clear that this movement is about much more than one alleged crime. It is about the fundamental right to safety, justice, and transparency in a country where powerful institutions too often escape accountability. The government's response, marked by denials and suppression, has only deepened the crisis, suggesting that those in power are more concerned with protecting Pakistan's image than addressing the systematic issues at play. For the students protesting in the streets of Lahore, Rawalpindi, and beyond, this is not just a battle for justice for one girl. It is a fight for their future, a future where they can trust the institutions meant to protect them, rather than fear them. Whether their voices will be heard or drowned out by a state desperate to maintain control remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: Pakistan's youth are no longer willing to be silenced.